All right, everybody, we are into chapter 3 today. And if you remember from what we were doing in the ethical hacking part of this class, the book made a pretty clear differentiation between passive and active sort of enumeration and footprinting. And this book does something similar, but it puts both of those things within one chapter. So we're going to start off by talking about some of the more passive ways that you can gather information about systems. And then in the second video, we'll move on to some of the more active scans that are more likely to sort of trip alarms. So let's go ahead and get started here. When you're starting to do any sort of penetration test, the first thing that you're going to go look for is what's referred to as OSINT, or open source intelligence. This is going to be any information that's publicly available about whatever it is that you were trying to penetrate. So this is anything that you can gather sort of out on the internet, and there are a whole bunch of different ways that information can be something that you can find. Again, with white box testing and black box testing, things are going to be a little bit different. This may be information that you have to go and track down yourself if you're doing a black box test. This may be something that is provided to you if you're doing a white box test, and then gray box testing is going to be a little bit less clearly defined. There's a couple sort of search engines out there that are designed specifically for people that are doing security work like this. Shodan and Census are two of the largest ones, but there's also data that you can find about companies that you're trying to compromise on normal internet search sort of engines, or via DNS, or social media sites, or public records. There's all sorts of things that you could use to get this information. So before going on, I think the book doesn't put this in the slide, but it sort of talks about the organizations that you can go track down if you're looking for this sort of information. The first one it talks about are CERTs, CERT, and this is any sort of team that's been put together to respond to computer problems. There was an original CERT, and people thought that was such a good idea that now there are CERTs kind of all over the place. I think the initial one was with Carnegie Mellon. And there's a couple others that are sort of specific to a region or to a specific topic, but that's a good way to go find information. The other one that the book mentions, and this has come up a couple times in this class and the ethical hacking class, is NIST, and I'm actually going to pull up NIST's homepage here. As you can tell from this this is NIST.gov, tells us it's actually something that is the U.S. government. This is a U.S. government funded sort of project here, and this is actually part of the Department of Commerce. But NIST publishes a whole bunch of standards and resources, just basically data that you can find about penetration testing. A lot of their documentation starts with SP, and then it has some sort of number that goes along with it. There's a particular one that your book mentions, SP 800-115, that is something that's particularly used by people that are doing penetration testing. But that's another one that's not going to have necessarily information about a specific target that you have, but it's going to have a lot of information about penetration testing in general. I think another one to talk about here is MITRE, and if this sounds familiar to you, this is going to be this is another. Well, this isn't exactly a government project, but it's a nonprofit that it's pretty closely associated with the federal government. If you guys remember that scholarship for service, MITRE was one of the places that they want you to, that you could potentially get a job if you apply for that scholarship. And you'll be interested to know, at least I was interested to know, that they actually do have one of their offices that is in Huntsville. But MITRE does the same sort of thing, where they're going to publish a whole bunch of tools and lists that are of use to you if you're doing any sort of penetration testing or cybersecurity work. There's a couple different lists that the book mentions. I don't think it's necessarily worth going over all of those in detail, but we're on page about 62 to 63 if that's something that you are interested in pursuing further. It's just a whole lot of documentation that could be of use to you if you are doing sort of any penetration test at all. Um, see, sort of in continuing with these sort of things here, the book mentions something called full disclosure, which if you go look for that, it's right here. But this is a mailing list that has will keep you up to date with what's going on in the security world right now. So not specific to a particular vendor. And it's but that's one of the mailing lists that gets run through seclists.org. If you're interested in signing up for any of these, there are, as you can see, a whole pile of them. So those are things that exist and that you should know about. There's one more thing to talk about here is what's referred to as the SANS Internet Storm Center. The book mentions a couple websites from SANS, and these are this is the same sort of thing. There's going to be a whole bunch of information about security and penetration testing that's available here. So this is a little bit different format than what you would expect to see from NIST. This has more in the way of podcasts and some stuff like that. Makes it a little bit different than just sort of reading white papers about security standards and procedures. But if that's something that you guys are interested in, this is another website that is probably worth checking out here. Um, there are a whole bunch of ways that you can get information about specific companies. I think probably what we've talked about up until now is more generic about security in general, sort of latest developments in the field. But you're also going to be looking at data that is sort of specific to the company that you're trying to compromise, and this gets into a little bit more detail about that. Now, one of the things that the book talks about here is trying to analyze metadata. So metadata is going to be data that is written about data. And so one of the examples of this that I think talked about in the first half of this class, if not, I think we typically cover it in the forensics class here at Calhoun, is something called EXIF tool. Now, for those of you that are not aware, anytime you take a digital picture, if you have not gone and changed the settings within your camera, there is a bunch of data that is also written that is kind of goes above and beyond just the ones and zeros that comprise the JPEG image. It'll give you information about the photo, the camera that was used, the exposure length. If you take a picture on your phone, a lot of times it'll record the GPS coordinates as well. I think I told you guys a story earlier this year about being able to find a particular obscure place in Kentucky that sold bourbon because my neighbor sent me a picture of his wife in the store, and even though he didn't think he was giving me the address, this is something that he gave me. Now, there's all sorts of data that sort of is inadvertently attached to documents that you can learn about if you go look for the metadata. One of the weirder stories that I heard recently, and I don't have this at my fingertips, is there was, I believe it was an exercise site that would record the results of your jogging, and enough people were jogging in this place where it looked like nothing was that it wound up being a pretty important security leak because people figured out there was a military base there because all these guys that they knew that were in the military were going out for their daily jog, and if they still had that information tagged on, then their phone or whatever it was that this was running on would report back to the website, hey, congratulations, you did great on your daily jog, here's where you went. Well, that's information that they probably didn't want to have out there. But be aware that this isn't necessarily something that's going to just be in existence with digital photos, although that's probably the the best example here, that's generally the only thing that EXIF works with, is digital photos. But there could be metadata in say Microsoft Word documents. If you go look for the metadata, you can figure out who the software is registered to, or who was logged in when the file was generated. All that kind of stuff. That's all the sort of metadata that can be used to look for information about companies. So if there's a company out there and they have pictures from something that they've done on their website, well, if you're able to look at the metadata of those pictures using EXIF, you probably have a little bit more of an idea about who was taking those photographs, or where they were, or what time it was, than the company may want you to have. Now, the book here mentions something that it refers to as FOCA, and this is a fairly obscure piece of software. I went looking for it, and let's pull it up here. First of all, if you want to go look at the Wikipedia page for it, oddly enough, there is not one in English. This is one that, as you can see, is written in Spanish here and has been translated by Google Translate. But this is actually the software that we're looking at, and it is hosted on GitHub. It's free, so if you want to go look for this or get a copy of it, this is free software that you can download and play with if you'd like. What this is designed to do is go pull a bunch of documents or any sort of information that can get using a couple of different search engines here, and it's going to go look for metadata that's sort of embedded in those documents. So if you're trying to get information about any sort of corporation that you're trying to compromise, this is a useful tool to use. It's a little bit obscure, and the book doesn't talk about it much, but that's what it is. So, okay, I think that's probably about all we need to say about that. So, in addition to those sort of ways of getting information, you can also get technical data via places like DNS, or not places, but services like DNS or places like Whois. So I think this is something that we mentioned in the last half of the class too, but just in case, if you pull up Whois, this is the Whois lookup for Calhoun right here. So what I've done is I've gone to whois.net and then typed in a domain, and it gives me all this sort of information about it, when this was registered, who's the name servers that are used with it. It actually gives us some stuff here that it doesn't look like anybody filled out, but there should be a contact email and phone number there for if you're doing everything that you're supposed to do. But you're welcome to go look at Whois and try to figure out information that you want to about really any sort of domain that's out there. So the way it works, the way that it works like this is anybody that registers a domain has to go register that with a domain name registrar. And if you've ever gotten a website, you're familiar with this process. But when you register that information, they give you have to give them a bunch of information about yourself, and that's what can show up there. Whois is sort of pulls from those internet registrars, and is generally a pretty good way of getting information, at least basic information about somebody's domain name. I think quite a few of you have probably used traceroute in some of the networking classes that you've used. Another way that you can pull this information is with NS lookup. So if I've done an NS lookup on calhoun.edu, what this is, and then another one on my own website right here. But I think NS lookup is designed to let you sort of access DNS and see what's going on there. And if you guys don't remember, DNS is the service that will translate something like a domain name here to an actual IP address. It's something that's really important to have running on your servers, or suddenly it doesn't look like you can get to any websites that you know and love anymore. So, but NS lookup is a way that you can go figure out, and should be built into Windows. You should just be able to type it like this, NS lookup, and then the domain name that you're trying to look up. By the way, if you just type NS lookup, it's going to tell you what domain server it's using, and then wait for you to continue asking it for information there. So that's how that works. There are DNS is a distributed database. It's not all on one on one server. You can tell that when we pulled up that command prompt there, we were able to see what DNS server it was using. Well, that means anytime any sort of DNS information is changed, that information has to propagate out to all the DNS servers that are in existence. And when that information is transferred, that's referred to as a DNS zone transfer. And if you were able to ask a server for the sort of information that it needs with the DNS zone transfer, you could potentially wind up with a whole bunch of information that people might not expect you to be able to have. I think that's probably about all we need to say about that. Let's take a look here. Okay, now this is all right. So this is actually, we've already gone over this. They put the slides in a little bit of a strange order here, but that's the organizations that we talked about earlier that publish a bunch of the information for people that are penetration testers. So that's all for the sort of passive footprinting that we're going to talk about for the first half of this chapter. When we come back, we'll talk about active reconnaissance here. So we'll be back shortly.